The first sign that something is wrong isn't the silence. It's your phone. You look down. No signal. No problem, you think. You'll just keep driving until the next town. Except, there isn't one. Not for another 200 miles. The temperature is dropping. Your fuel gauge is lower than you remember. The last vehicle passed almost an hour ago, and somewhere ahead, a mountain pass is disappearing behind blowing snow. Out here, nobody knows exactly where you are, and if your engine stops, the Arctic won't give you a second chance. Every year, thousands of people willingly drive into this. Truck drivers, motorcyclists, photographers, tourists, chasing the Arctic Circle. Some call it the adventure of a lifetime. Others call it the most dangerous drive in North America. The strange part is, they're talking about two different highways. One was built to feed America's largest oil field. The other was built to connect communities at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. Both cross landscapes so remote that rescue can take hours, or even days. Both force you to trust a road built on permanently frozen ground. And both are slowly being changed by an Arctic that isn't as frozen as it used to be. So, which highway is actually more dangerous? The James W. Dalton Highway in Alaska, or Canada's legendary Dempster Highway? To answer that, you first have to understand something most people never realize. These roads were never supposed to exist. Why build a road here? Look at a map of North America. Now look at the Arctic. You'll notice something strange. Roads slowly disappear. Cities become tiny dots. Eventually, there's almost nothing. For thousands of years, these landscapes were crossed the same way. By river, by dog sled, on foot. The Arctic wasn't empty. People had lived here for generations. But permanent roads? Those were almost impossible. Because the Arctic has a secret. It doesn't stay still. What looks like solid ground is actually frozen soil called permafrost. It can remain frozen for thousands of years, but disturb it, or warm it, and everything changes. The ground softens, slopes begin to move, roads crack, entire hillsides slowly collapse. Engineers discovered this long before either highway was completed. The Arctic wasn't simply cold, it was alive, and it fought back against every attempt to build across it. One of the earliest attempts proved exactly that. Before the Dalton Highway existed, Alaska tried building a winter road toward Prudhoe Bay. On paper, it sounded logical. Frozen ground should make construction easier. Instead, the project damaged the delicate permafrost beneath it so badly that it had to be abandoned. The lesson was immediate. If you built these roads the same way you built roads everywhere else, the Arctic would destroy them. So engineers came up with an idea that sounded almost backwards. Instead of digging into the frozen ground, they would leave it alone. Huge layers of gravel, sometimes 8 feet thick, would be piled directly on top of the tundra. Those gravel embankments would act like a blanket, insulating the permafrost underneath and slowing the transfer of heat from the road above. It was an ingenious solution, one that made two of the most ambitious highways on Earth possible. But there was still one question nobody had answered. Why spend billions of dollars building roads through places where almost nobody lived? The answer begins in Alaska, with a discovery that changed the future of the Arctic forever: oil. The story of the Dalton Highway didn't begin with a road. It began with a problem. In 1967, geologists made one of the most important discoveries in American history. Beneath Alaska's frozen North Slope lay Prudhoe Bay, the largest oil field ever discovered in North America. For the United States, it was a breakthrough. For the engineers, it was a nightmare. Finding the oil was the easy part. Getting to it was something else entirely. There were no permanent roads, no railways, no ports, no towns large enough to support a project of this scale. Only mountains, frozen rivers, and hundreds of miles of wilderness that had defeated explorers for generations. The oil was there, but it might as well have been on another planet. America needed a way in, not next year, immediately, because every month of delay meant millions of dollars waiting beneath frozen ground. The solution was as ambitious as it was unbelievable. Build a highway through one of the harshest environments on Earth, then use it to build an 800-mile pipeline capable of carrying crude oil all the way to Alaska's southern coast. It sounded impossible. Some people believed it was. But before anyone could dream about pipelines, the Arctic delivered its first warning. An earlier attempt to create access using a winter road had already failed. Engineers assumed frozen ground would make construction easier. Instead, the project damaged the very thing supporting it. The protective layer above the permafrost was disturbed. The frozen ground began to thaw. The road quickly became unstable. It had to be abandoned. It was an expensive lesson. In the Arctic, the ground beneath your feet can be your greatest enemy. So the engineers changed everything. Instead of cutting into the tundra, they built on top of it. Massive gravel embankments, some nearly 8 feet thick, were laid across the landscape like giant insulating blankets. The goal wasn't just to support heavy trucks. It was to stop the road's heat from melting the frozen earth underneath. Think about how unusual that is. Most roads are designed to sit on the ground. This one was designed to protect the ground from the road itself. Then came the impossible deadline. Construction resumed in 1974. Workers had one short Arctic summer. Just 5 months. 5 months to carve nearly 390 miles of highway through mountains, rivers, muskeg, and frozen wilderness before winter shut everything down. Every day mattered. Bulldozers pushed forward almost around the clock. Gravel trucks formed endless convoys. Surveyors stayed only a few miles ahead of the construction crews. If they lost the race against winter, the entire pipeline project could fall behind. Against extraordinary odds, they did it. Not because the Arctic became easier, but because thousands of people refused to stop. The finished road wasn't called the Dalton Highway. Not yet. Everyone simply knew it as the pipeline almost certainly wouldn't have happened. For years, ordinary people weren't even allowed to drive most of it. This road belonged to industry, to construction crews, to truck drivers willing to spend days crossing some of the most isolated country in America. Eventually, control passed to the state of Alaska. Public access slowly expanded. By 1994, drivers could finally travel the entire route to Deadhorse. A road built for oil had unexpectedly become one of the world's most famous overland adventures. But that didn't make it any safer. Because every truck still had somewhere to go. Every blind corner still carried risk. And ahead, one obstacle stood between every driver and the Arctic Ocean: the Brooks Range. Hidden inside those mountains is a pass so dangerous that even experienced truckers treat it with respect. A place where storms can arrive in the middle of summer, where avalanches are a constant threat, and where one mistake can leave you completely alone. It's called Atigun Pass. And for many people, this is where the Dalton Highway truly begins. Reaching the Dalton Highway isn't difficult. Surviving it is something else entirely. For the first few miles, it doesn't feel especially intimidating. The road stretches toward the horizon. The forests are quiet. The traffic is light. You start to wonder if its reputation has been exaggerated. That's exactly when the Dalton becomes dangerous. Because this highway doesn't overwhelm you all at once. It wears down your confidence, 1 mile at a time. The farther north you drive, the fewer signs of civilization remain. Gas stations become rare. Buildings disappear. Even the trees begin to vanish. Then, almost without realizing it, you cross the Arctic Circle. It feels like a milestone, a photograph, a bucket list moment. But in reality, you've just crossed an invisible line into one of the least forgiving environments in North America. From here, the Dalton begins asking questions. Did you bring enough fuel? Enough food? Enough water? A spare tire? A second spare tire? Because out here, there are no quick solutions. A flat tire isn't just an inconvenience. It can become the start of a survival story. And the Dalton has a way of exposing every mistake you've made before you even realize you've made it. But even if your vehicle is perfectly prepared, there's another problem. One you can't fix with tools: communication. For hundreds of miles, your phone becomes little more than a camera. Cell towers simply don't exist across most of the route. If you expect to call roadside assistance, you're on the wrong highway. Professional drivers know this. That's why many of them still rely on CB radios. Long before smartphones, truckers used them to warn each other about blind corners, approaching convoys, accidents, and dangerous road conditions. On the Dalton, they still do. Visitors are encouraged to carry satellite communication devices instead, because if something goes wrong, someone has to know you're out there before anyone can come looking. Then there are the trucks. A lot of people imagine the Dalton as an empty road. It isn't. This is still the supply route for Alaska's North Slope. Every day, heavy transport trucks carry fuel, equipment, construction materials, and supplies toward Prudhoe Bay. Many of the drivers have crossed this highway hundreds of times. They know every curve, every hill, every blind corner, but even they don't underestimate it. On narrow gravel sections, passing isn't always simple. Dust clouds can reduce visibility to almost nothing. Loose stones are thrown into the air like shrapnel. One cracked windshield quickly becomes 2, then 3. Many travelers finish the Dalton with fresh chips across the front of their vehicles. It's almost considered part of the experience. Then comes the road itself. Roughly 3/4 of the Dalton isn't paved. Instead, it's covered with gravel treated using calcium chloride. The chemical serves an important purpose. When conditions are dry, it helps keep dust under control. But add rain, and everything changes. The gravel transforms into a thick layer of sticky mud. Drivers often compare it to wet cement. It coats the underside of vehicles, brakes, suspension, axles. Even after the trip ends, many people are still washing Arctic mud from places they can't easily reach. It's one of those details almost nobody mentions before making the journey, until they've experienced it themselves. But surprisingly, none of these are what most experienced drivers fear the most. Not the trucks, not the gravel, not even the isolation. Because eventually, the Brooks Range rises in front of you. And with it, the single greatest obstacle on the Dalton Highway, Atigun Pass. At nearly 4,900 feet above sea level, it's the highest year-round maintained highway pass in Alaska. It's also where the Arctic reminds everyone who's really in control. Winter storms don't politely announce themselves here. They arrive, sometimes with blinding snow, sometimes with violent crosswinds, sometimes with avalanches, and occasionally, all three at once. There have even been years when winter weather warnings were issued in the middle of July. Imagine planning a summer road trip, only to find yourself driving through a snowstorm. Truck drivers know something tourists often don't. The mountain doesn't care how experienced you are. Every climb demands patience. Every descent demands respect. One mistake on an icy grade can become a recovery operation measured in hours, or longer. But here's the surprising part. For all its mountains, for all its trucks, for all its isolation, many veteran Arctic travelers will still tell you, the Dalton isn't the road that worries them the most. Because hundreds of miles to the east, Canada built a highway with fewer trucks, fewer people, and one danger the Dalton never has to face. Every single year, parts of it become impossible to cross. If the Dalton Highway exists because of oil, the Dempster Highway exists because of people, at least. That's how the story ends. It didn't begin that way. Long before tourists dreamed of driving to the Arctic Ocean, Canada was asking a different question. How do you maintain a presence in a region where there are almost no permanent roads? The answer wasn't just maps or flags. It was infrastructure. A road that would push farther north than almost anyone thought practical. One that could support exploration, strengthen Canada's presence in the Arctic, and eventually connect remote northern communities to the rest of the country. It was an ambitious idea. Some believed it was impossible. Others thought it was unnecessary. The Arctic had a habit of proving both groups wrong. Construction began in 1959. For a while, everything seemed to be moving forward. Then the money disappeared. Oil exploration around Eagle Plains failed to produce the results many had expected. Funding dried up. The project stalled, and the unfinished highway simply ended. Not at a town, not at a destination. Just in the wilderness. For years, that's where it stayed. A reminder that even governments sometimes lose their battle with the North. Then, something happened across the border. In Alaska, Prudhoe Bay was discovered. Suddenly, the Arctic wasn't just a remote frontier anymore. It became strategically important. Canada looked north again. Construction resumed. Engineers crossed mountain ranges, river valleys, and endless stretches of tundra. Finally, in 1979, the Dempster Highway officially opened. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because for decades, the road still stopped at Inuvik. If you wanted to continue to the Arctic Ocean, you couldn't drive there. You waited for winter. When the rivers froze solid, temporary ice roads connected the final stretch. The rest of the year, that connection simply didn't exist. Then, in 2017, everything changed. The Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway opened. For the first time in history, you could drive from southern Canada all the way to the Arctic Ocean. It was a dream that had taken generations to achieve. But for the people living there, it meant something much more practical. Fresh food arrived more easily. Fuel became less expensive to transport. Medical access improved. Construction created jobs. Communities that had relied on seasonal ice roads finally had a permanent connection to the rest of the country. That's one of the biggest differences between these two highways. The Dalton was built to move supplies. The Dempster was built to move lives. But don't mistake that for safety. If anything, the Dempster hides its dangers better. Unlike the Dalton, there are no endless convoys of heavy trucks reminding you to stay alert. Traffic is lighter. The scenery is peaceful. The silence feels comforting. Until you realize, silence can be dangerous. There are stretches where more than 400 kilometers pass with almost no cellular coverage. If your vehicle fails, you can't assume help is one phone call away. Experienced travelers don't pack satellite communicators because they're adventurous. They pack them because they know what happens without one. Then there's the road. Almost entirely gravel. Sharp stones constantly thrown into the air. Long washboard sections that slowly shake every bolt on your vehicle. Many travelers carry 2 spare tires. Not because they're unlucky. Because they've learned from people who were. On roads like this, preparation isn't paranoia. It's survival. And then, just when you think you've finally figured the Dempster out, you reach its greatest weakness. Water. The Dalton crosses the Yukon River on a permanent bridge. The Dempster doesn't have that luxury. To continue north, every vehicle must cross the Peel River, then the Mackenzie River. During summer, ferries carry vehicles across. During winter, ice roads replace them. It's an elegant system, until the seasons begin to change. Every spring, the ice becomes too weak to drive on, but the rivers are still too frozen for ferries. Then, months later, the opposite happens. The ice hasn't formed yet. The ferries can no longer operate. For several weeks every year, there is no crossing, not because the road is damaged, not because of an accident, because nature simply refuses to cooperate. The highway doesn't become dangerous, it becomes incomplete. Entire communities north of the rivers must rely almost entirely on aircraft until the crossings reopen. Imagine driving nearly 1,000 kilometers, only to discover that the road ahead no longer exists. You don't turn around because you made a mistake. You turn around because the Arctic made the decision for you. But strangely, even this isn't the story that gave the Dempster Highway its name. That story happened decades earlier, when 4 experienced men disappeared into these same mountains, and one search leader refused to stop looking. Roads don't usually carry stories. They carry names. And most of us never stop to ask where those names came from. But in the Arctic, those names were earned. Long before there was a highway stretching across Canada's far north, there was a police patrol. In December 1910, 4 members of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police left Fort McPherson on what should have been a routine winter journey. The route was familiar. The men were experienced. They carried supplies. They knew the land. There was no reason to believe they wouldn't return. But they never did. Weeks passed. Then months. No one knew what had happened. Some believed they had become lost in a blizzard. Others feared starvation. There was only one certainty. 4 men had vanished into one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, and someone had to find them. That responsibility fell to Inspector William Dempster. He organized one of the most determined searches the Canadian North had ever seen. For months, his team battled deep snow, brutal temperatures, and enormous distances. Eventually, they found the patrol. The men had died trying to make it back to safety. Their supplies were gone. Their strength had run out. The Arctic had claimed them. It was a tragedy that left a lasting mark on northern Canada. Years later, when the new highway was finally built through this region, it wasn't named after a politician or an engineer. It was named after the man who refused to stop searching, William Dempster. A reminder that some of the North's greatest stories aren't about conquest. They're about duty. The Dalton Highway tells a different story. Many people assume James W. Dalton built the road. He didn't. In fact, roads don't usually carry stories. They carry names. And most of us never stop to ask where those names came from. But in the Arctic, those names were earned. Long before there was a highway stretching across Canada's far north, there was a police patrol. In December 1910, 4 members of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police left Fort McPherson on what should have been a routine winter journey. The route was familiar. The men were experienced. They carried supplies. They knew the land. There was no reason to believe they wouldn't return. But they never did. Weeks passed, then months. No one knew what had happened. Some believed they had become lost in a blizzard. Others feared starvation. There was only one certainty. 4 men had vanished into one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, and someone had to find them. That responsibility fell to Inspector William Dempster. He organized one of the most determined searches the Canadian North had ever seen. For months, his team battled deep snow, brutal temperatures, and enormous distances. Eventually, they found the patrol. The men had died trying to make it back to safety. Their supplies were gone. Their strength had run out. The Arctic had claimed them. It was a tragedy that left a lasting mark on northern Canada. Years later, when the new highway was finally built through this region, it wasn't named after a politician or an engineer. It was named after the man who refused to stop searching, William Dempster. A reminder that some of the North's greatest stories aren't about conquest. They're about duty. The Dalton Highway tells a different story. Many people assume James W. Dalton built the road. He didn't. In fact, he never saw it. James William Dalton was an engineer with Alaska's Department of Highways, writes the final chapter. For decades, the biggest challenge facing these highways seemed obvious: snow, ice, cold. Engineers learned how to deal with all of them. Snowplows cleared the roads. Avalanche zones were monitored. Gravel embankments protected the frozen ground below. It wasn't easy, but it worked. Then, the Arctic started changing. And suddenly, the problem wasn't that the ground was too frozen. It was that it wasn't frozen enough. Permafrost is easy to misunderstand. People imagine it as solid rock. In reality, it's frozen soil holding everything together. Roads, hillsides, riverbanks, entire landscapes. When it stays frozen, the ground remains surprisingly stable. But when temperatures rise, the ice hidden beneath the surface begins to melt. The earth settles unevenly. Slopes begin to move. Cracks appear where there were none before. A road that looked perfectly safe one summer can require major repairs the next. The Arctic isn't collapsing overnight. It's changing inch by inch. And that's what makes it so difficult to fight. The Dalton Highway has already seen what that looks like. In one section, engineers encountered an area so unstable that it earned a nickname: the Blob. The frozen ground beneath the highway slowly thawed. The earth began to creep downhill. Year after year, repairing the surface wasn't enough. Because the road wasn't the real problem, the ground underneath it was moving. Eventually, engineers had to reroute part of the highway entirely. It was a reminder that no amount of asphalt or gravel can negotiate with geology. The Dempster faces a different challenge. its greatest weakness has always been water. As weather patterns become less predictable, the timing of freeze-up and break-up becomes harder to anticipate. Some years, river crossings operate as expected. Other years, communities face longer periods when ferries can't run and ice roads aren't safe. The highway is still there, but the connections that make it usable become less certain. For people who depend on that route, uncertainty isn't an inconvenience. It's part of everyday life. And yet, despite everything, people still come. Every summer, travelers from around the world point their vehicles north. Some want to photograph the midnight sun. Others dream of reaching the Arctic Ocean. Truck drivers continue hauling supplies. Families continue living in northern communities. Scientists continue studying a landscape that's changing before their eyes. Life doesn't stop because the Arctic is difficult. People simply learn to live with the difficulty. That may be the most remarkable thing about these roads. Not that they exist, but that they continue to exist. Every season, they are repaired, rebuilt, adjusted, protected. Not because nature has been defeated, but because people refuse to give up. So, which highway is more dangerous? The Dalton, with its heavy trucks, mountain passes, and endless isolation? Or the Dempster, with its seasonal river crossings, remote communities, and thousands of kilometers of gravel? The truth is, there isn't a single answer. Ask a truck driver, and they'll probably point to the Dalton. Ask someone who has waited days for a river crossing to reopen, and they may choose the Dempster. Both roads demand preparation. Both punish overconfidence. Both remind you how quickly comfort disappears when civilization is hundreds of miles away. But after everything we've seen, maybe that's the wrong question, because the real story was never about which road is worse. It was about why these roads exist at all. They were built because people believed they could connect places that seemed impossible to reach. They crossed mountains, tundra, permafrost, rivers, and landscapes that had challenged explorers for centuries. They are monuments to human determination, but they are also monuments to humility. Because every year, the Arctic reminds us that these highways don't survive because we've conquered nature. They survive because every single day, people adapt to it. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson these roads have to teach. No matter how advanced our machines become, no matter how ambitious our engineering is, there are still places on Earth where nature writes the final chapter.